Hello YouTube. Thought I'd do a video on how to replace a leaking water toilet water supply valve, although all this would also apply to any of the shutoff valves that you have under your sink or toilet. And for this one I had there are different styles which I'll go over here, but for this toilet, this is an older style with a multi-turn shutoff valve that was sweated on to a piece of copper pipe. And so I've already taken it off. But for this video, I thought I'd walk through different options for how to remove one and also different options of what to replace it with. So in this example, this was a sweat-on valve, so this is the part that went into the wall. It's the copper pipe that I cut through. And then the other option you have is a compression fitting. Basically this piece here slides on. This would slide on first. Then you would slide this piece called a ferrule on, and then you would screw it on. And then when you tighten the nut, it squeezes the ferrule around the copper pipe to make a watertight seal. The other option you can buy is the same thing that we took off. Basically, you just slide this on to the copper pipe, and you have to solder it on, okay? And soldering requires a blowtorch, and it requires solder. Find my solder here. There it is. So you have to have a blowtorch, you have to have solder, you have to have a thing called flux that makes the solder, and then even if you have all that stuff, you got to worry about burning a hole in the wall or burning your trim or setting something on fire. And it can be done, and it's a very reliable joint if you do it properly, but it's just a lot of trouble. So that's why I think I'm going to go with the compression fitting. The other problem with the sweated on joint is if you have to replace it, you have to cut it off like I did. And fortunately, I had enough room to get a cutter on, but this is the cutter I used. You can see, once I slide the new fitting on, it's going to take up some of that copper, and I'll only have room for maybe one more time to cut it off before I'm getting into the wall. You can remove them without cutting it, but it's tricky, and again it involves heating up the old joint with a blowtorch until the solder loosens and then trying to wiggle it off. But even in that case, you have solder that's behind that stays on the pipe and will interfere with making a good second joint. So compression fitting, you still, if you have to replace it, if it's this part that's leaking, you can replace it and leave the ferrule that was on there before. But there may be cases where you have to remove the ferrule, and they do make tools for that as well, a specialty tool to remove the ferrule. But anyway, I think I'm going to go with the compression fitting because if I ever have to replace it, I think it'll be a little bit easier to get off and replace than with the sweat joint. The second thing to consider, and actually the reason this particular valve failed, we've been talking about how you connect the valve to the copper pipe, but in my case the part that was leaking was this side where the cutoff valve is. And the reason that is you can see here's the inside of the old valve. This goes in here, and inside was this rubber washer, and you can see the reason it was leaking is this rubber washer dried up and got hard, and that's why it leaked. So one option I had was to just get another valve of this type, unscrew it, put in with a new rubber washer. Or theoretically, I could have just gotten a rubber washer and used this piece again. Because basically all that happens is when you screw down this valve, it pushes the rubber washer against the inside of the pipe and seals it off. Okay, but I didn't want to do that because I don't want to, years down the road, have another washer dry up. And these things are notoriously bad for failing, typically when people are out of town. They decide it's a good idea to shut off the water to the toilet, then they leave town, this thing fails, and they come home to, especially if it's a leak on the second floor, the ceiling has caved in or the floor is full of water and it's just a bad valve. So I'm going back with a ball valve, also called a quarter turn valve. So again, these are both quarter turn valves. This one is the sweat type, and this one is the compression fitting type. So that being said, I'm going to go back with the compression fitting quarter turn valve. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is the it's called an escutcheon or a split flange or a flange. This one's made out of aluminum or tin or something, some kind of metal. And you can see how it's gotten tarnished over the years. So I went back with, or I'm going to go back with this type, which is plastic, which I know is not as well made or maybe not as durable, but I don't think it's going to get the rust on it like that one did. So I'm going to go with this one, and this one also, you know, in this case I've cut the valve off, so it's not a problem to slide this guy on before I start. But this is also what's called a split flange, and you can see there the line right here. That's made to be broken in, along that split flange, so you can slide it around your copper pipe if you haven't taken the valve off. So for those two reasons, I'm going to go with the split flange so I can take it off if I ever need to, and I'm going with the plastic so I don't have to worry about looking like that. Now, if you want to get this one off without taking your shutoff valve off, this is your trick right here. These are just some sheet metal cutter tools, and they come in, I think, 3 different types. This is a center cut, and they make a left angle and a right angle. Yeah, but for the purpose of taking off the flange, any of those will work. You just want to kind of pull this away from the wall to where you can get in here and just cut through it, because you can see it's pretty thin metal. All right. Talk a little bit about, just to step back a minute and talk about how I cut this guy off. In my case, I was fortunate enough, as I showed you earlier, to have enough room to get this guy around it and cut it off. And basically, you just need enough smooth area on the pipe so that this thing can spin around the pipe. And basically, you hook it on the pipe right here. I wish I could show you, but I don't have any extra pipe. But I'll demonstrate with a fitting here. Basically, you just loosen it until you can fit the pipe in. And then you tighten it down on the rollers there. Okay? And then you basically just turn this thing about a quarter to a half turn. And then you rotate. It's hard to do this with one hand. But basically tighten this up one turn, and then you would spin this cutter around the pipe. Basically, you can see how the blade here. Sorry for this one. All right, but you can see the blade there, and as you just spin the cutter around the pipe, it will score it. And then after you go around one time, you tighten this another, maybe not even a half turn, maybe a quarter to an eighth of a turn. The idea being you just want to push that cutter wheel into the pipe a little bit more each turn. And eventually it'll just break right off, and you got a nice smooth cut. And then I just used, they make special sandpaper for plumbing, but I just used some 100 grit sandpaper here, and just basically clean off off the pipe and get it nice and smooth. Wipe it down with a rag. That's another important thing. Have a couple of towels and old towels, washcloths, whatever, laying around before you, after you cut the water off and before you cut the valve off. Which, if I didn't mention that before, that's a very important step. For this right here, you have to cut the water off to the whole house so that when you cut this pipe off, you don't have gallons of water flooding your bathroom. But anyway, I always keep a couple of spare towels around to wipe up little drips. Okay, so I've talked about the valves, I've talked about the flange, I've talked about the cutter. They make different size cutters, so this one will get in if you have a tight space and don't have room to spin this guy around because it's hitting the toilet or whatever. They do make a little miniature version that fits even in a tighter spot. But if those don't work, then your options are, like I talked about before, heating up with a torch and getting some, channel locks or something on the valve, and just heat it up while you're pulling and twisting. And then the other option is to use a hacksaw. So you got a hacksaw here with a good metal blade. This looks like an older blade. I would probably get a new sharp one. Again, this is very bulky saw. Might be tight, very hard to get back in that tight space. So they make one like this that hooks onto the blade, and it's a little easier to get back in there. So anyway, those are your options. And again, I'm going with the compression, and I've read some posts on the web, and the prevailing wisdom on the internet is that the compression fittings are a little bit better from the standpoint of they're easier to replace if something were to go bad. The sweated joints, going to be for sure joint's not going to leak, but it's going to be harder to change out in the future. Everybody seems to agree that these quarter turn valves are way more reliable than these type with the rubber washers. My recommendations are get a quarter turn. You can decide whether you want a sweat joint or a compression joint. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about was the supply tube. So this is what goes from the shutoff valve up to the top of the toilet, or to where it hooks into the toilet. So that's this part. This is the kind that was on there. I don't like this one because it's very, you have to get it cut to the exact height and size it needs to be. And again, it has the ferrule. So I think once you get this installed, it's probably a little more reliable. The best kind is this right here, but these only come in standard sizes. And this one here, you can see it's pretty close, but even with it being an inch too long, it's not very flexible as far as getting it into the spot. So this is probably your best bet if you can take the time and get the right size, the right length. The braided hose is definitely more reliable. The third type that I don't have here is the gray, a gray plastic version of this. And basically it's a plastic tube with a plastic ferrule instead of the brass. And those are the cheapest, but they're probably not very reliable. So now that I'm saying this out loud on the video, I think I've talked myself into trying to find something to make this work and go back with a braided one. So anyway, that's the hopefully a very thorough explanation of the parts of your shutoff valves. And again, all these same things apply to the valves under your sink. They're exactly the same thing, except for generally this is a little bit longer supply line, and you would have a different connector here on this end for a toilet versus what you would need for a sink. But other than that, the concepts all apply. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. If you like my video, please click the like and subscribe, and try and put out some more videos later. Thanks. Bye.